well. Dr. Lisle, how are you doing today?
Good. Good to be back.
Excellent. Well, we're going to be talking about, we actually have a lot of listener emails this week. So I just want to tell our listeners that we really appreciate them emailing us. So we're going to go over as many questions as we can. But before we do, really interesting article from the Evolutionary Psychology News. The article is called Assessment of Long-Term Mate Preferences in Iran. The Iran part's going to be relevant in just a bit. But basically, the research indicates that maybe there might be some long-term mate preferences that can be assessed in a similar way to the Big Five personality characteristics. So the three designs to this particular paper, they were trying to collect more data for this using focus groups and then develop psychometrically accurate long-term mate preferences in men. And then the third arm of this research project was to develop a sex-neutral scale for preferences. And using factor analysis, what they found was that 6 dimensions emerged for men. And 6 dimensions emerged for sex-neutral preferences. Now, it's Iran, so I can't imagine why they didn't do it for the women, Who knows?
Who cares what they think?
Right.
Oh, my
so
God.
For the men,
all right, go ahead.
They came up with a acronym. It's family. Here's the 6 dimensions. Family, attractiveness, kindness, education, religiosity, and status. Now, I don't know if I'm the only one who noticed this. I can't possibly be. But that's the acronym that spells fakers.
Okay. Very good. Okay.
And I'm not joking. This is how the article is set up. Like it's not set up so you can read it that way, but but that's the order.
Right. Yeah.
But
that's beautiful. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because if we look at this, education is going to be essentially intelligence, and religiosity is going to essentially be conscientiousness. And kindness is obviously going to be agreeableness. Physical attractiveness is what it is. Family is going to be, family and status are going to be sort of interesting variables in a culture that probably, I don't know much about that, the Persian culture, but I assume that there's pretty heavily stratified, almost a caste system, and someone who's out there might be squealing right now and saying, Dr. Lisle, you don't have any idea what you're talking about, which of course I don't. I'm speculating that as we see this come up as something that would be very significant for those individuals, those things would be important anywhere in the world, but they're obviously much less important in the United States. Because we don't have a caste system or really anything like that. So but it still matters sort of what family assets are being brought to bear, and that would include both status and family. And obviously in cultures like that, a lot of times like the mother-in-law lives with you, or you live with your mother-in-law. So this sort of issues are going on much more than. Yeah, right. You got it. So really, I'm surprised that they're talking about the factor analysis as if they are developing a scale, quote, like the Big Five, because to me, I see 4 factors that are the Big Five, and then, of course, we're going to add, or 3 factors that are the Big Five, and then we're going to add attractiveness on top of that, which is obviously the lead variable in mate selection. And so that's what it looks like to me. So, but at any rate, good enough for them, and probably it's essentially a somewhat modified Big Five to that culture. Good, glad to see people doing kind of interesting research like that. Cool.
Yeah, I think for the family part of it, they also called it domesticity. So the culture there is probably highly dependent on that.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
The sex-neutral preferences for the 6 dimensions are it's essentially the same, but just in a different order.
Yeah.
Right. And there's no family in this one, actually. It's kindness, attractiveness, status, education, and religiosity. Or chastity is kind of what the...
Sort of going off to the same things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very,
Yeah.
good enough. They're sort of rediscovering. So I guess they're saying that these were the biggest things when they factor analyzed what people are looking for, and so they sort of we're not sure what's sitting inside that status variable. Again, a hierarchical variable. The religiosity is essentially you're looking inside. I think conscientiousness. I think it's a big issue there, and also potentially
closed-mindedness, maybe a closed.
Yes, very good. In other words, how open or closed someone is. Good for you. Yes, I think you're seeing possibly two variables being tapped into there. So yeah, but once again, for those listeners that are familiar with the way we think about things, you're seeing the footprint of the Big Five all over this as they have collected data from a culture that we haven't had data from before. We factor analyze mate preferences, and in it, no surprise, we see physical attractiveness, resources, and the Big Five footprint. Very good.
Mm-hmm. All right,
Makes
next article. The next article is actually by a developmental psychologist. It's called "Incorporating Development into Evolutionary Psychology." And what he's arguing is that adaptations develop regardless of genetics and are based on the highly plastic nature of an infant's and child's brains. So this is David Yorkland from Florida Atlantic University. So what he's proposing is that we incorporate developmental psychology into evolutionary psychology. And of course, he makes the case that it's the behavioral plasticity and the cognitive plasticity early in a child's life, and early perceptual and cognitive biases would result in adaptive behavior that would change things as they go along. But the two major areas that he claims can be better understood is, one, the role of parenting. So, for instance, if a parent is more authoritative versus, if their thinking is that if they're more authoritative, their kids will become more conscientious, that's a limiting belief that can be corrected. And then he makes a weak case, in my opinion, of he says that if we mesh these two together, it'll create a clearer picture of what it means to be a human.
All right. Here's what I have to say about this. First of all, he doesn't have any evidence, I'm sure. So, is a developmental psychologist who I think he's smelling the cannibal in the room is evolutionary psychology, and evolutionary psychology, even very early in the game, and particularly, actually, I would say behavior genetics, which isn't exactly evolutionary psychology, but it certainly is informed by thinking in evolution, is essentially cannibalized learning theory in the early 90s when Tooby and Cosmides and company sort of introduced this to the world. And about that same time, the behavior geneticists were coming up with data showing that essentially human beings do not develop their personalities by any sort of mimicry process. In other words, there's no correlation between the personality of a child that is adopted by someone and that parent. So they don't, and they're not even reacting to the parent in some way. So, in other words, if an adopted child has 2 or 3 siblings in the household, they all aren't reacting to a parent's, for example, authoritarianism, and then becoming either that way themselves or becoming very rebellious. This is simply not transpiring. So the correlation coefficients are 0. Now, let me tell you, it is difficult for me to describe what it's like to be an academic psychologist in the middle of academia where this very unpleasant news is being published, and there's no way to not publish it. And so this has laid waste to what we're going to call developmental psychology of the social order or social development. And this is what this guy's talking about. So there's developmental psychologists that are just interested in, for example, speech and language development, and so they do extraordinary, sophisticated and very detailed research in how the human being actually learns how to listen to and figure out sounds and when words begin and end, and then learn how to speak and all this sort of stuff. So that's very, very interesting work in cognitive development. But this guy is talking about social development. And we're going to find that, and the thing that you said is an amazing quote. So it's an amazing thing that he said, that he's arguing that the adaptations develop, quote, regardless of genetics, and are based on highly plastic nature of the children's infants' brains. This is insanity. I can't believe that anybody would say such a thing. Let me explain.
That wasn't a direct quote. That may have been just my ignorance.
All right. Okay, it might have been, because, in fact, if you're even close to, this sounds like something that would sound very sexy to an academician who had was making his bones in social development and doesn't want to hear anything about behavior genetics. But the notion that, first of all, adaptations are going to develop under extremely tight genetic control. So let me explain partially what this guy's even talking about, sort of, so in a way that the listeners can understand. I will argue that the adaptations, which means the little neural circuits that make up what a human is, for example, what's funny, okay? When you cry, why you make a sad face, what you find beautiful or handsome, what you find fun, what you find not fun, or quote, not funny, what you the ambition, feelings of ambition that you feel. All these kinds of things are going to be obviously they are human universals, and so therefore there are neural circuits inside the human being that are tightly constrained that cause those thoughts, feelings, and behavior and motivational processes. And they are so tightly constrained that it doesn't matter what environment you grow up in, they all wind up with the same equipment, which means that essentially it's like your hand. You start with a little tiny hand when you're born, and then that hand grows up. And as you get older, that hand gets bigger, okay? It gets bigger and stronger, and you have greater grip strength, etc. It emerges as an adult hand. It starts out as a little tiny hand, and it emerges as an adult hand. And as that happens, as the body goes from a little tiny body of 6 pounds or so into a 130-pound body, it's going to go through all kinds of metamorphoses. Things are going to get bigger. They're going to get hormones are going to turn on, and certain features are going to change, etc. But this thing is going to develop, in fact, under unbelievably tight genetic control. It doesn't. That little hand doesn't turn into a claw under different environmental circumstances at all. Okay, it doesn't really matter what environmental circumstances take place with respect to that hand. That hand winds up a human hand. That's what it's going to do. And the human mind winds up an adult human mind. It is, quote, not highly plastic at all. It has a thin veneer of plasticity that will cause it to, for example, learn a specific language, but it's learning a language, and it's learning a language in always the same way. Okay? So, and why does it always learn it in the same way? Because the genes constrain how human beings can learn a language. That's how it takes place. So this sounds to me like a social developmental psychologist who is hoping to find some middle ground with the enemy and try to, because the enemy is cannibalizing the field of social development easily for anybody who's paying attention. And so we're going to try to now say that, wow, development is really important. And I'm going to say, no, I don't think so, and you don't have any evidence to suggest that it is. I will certainly agree with the following truth that has to be true, and that is, in order for neural circuits to potentially develop normally in a certain way, certain environmental events must take place. Now, that, of course, is going to be the case. So a child living with wolves, with Romulus and Remus, adopted by wolves before Rome developed, could not have developed speech. Tarzan, Lord Greystoke living in the African jungle after his parents are killed, could not grow up and then, as Edgar Rice Burroughs said, this was Lord Greystoke, so he, the books were left behind by his parents, and he studied the books hard, and then pretty soon he's speaking English. This is beautiful. Of course, that is not possible. There are certain environmental events that are required for these neural circuits to be fine-tuned to work properly. However, they all normal environments of all humans, if they survive, get the environmental inputs that are required for these developmental programs to be sufficed with the environmental stimuli, so that they will develop normally. Okay, so that's why we don't have some bizarre place in the world where they're not doing something, and then we wind up with 80% of the kids being autistic. Never happens. Okay, so this is a mishmash. I'd have to read this thing, but just the sound of it sounds like this guy's trying to make big arguments for early child development and the plasticity of the human mind and how important the social environment's going to be. And I got news for him. You ain't going to find it, Chief. Your friends for the last 50 years have been trying to find it, and they've never found a scratch of data to support that position. What we're going to find, I had a very interesting interchange over the last week. I was talking to an orthopedic surgeon, and we were having a good old time, and I was explaining the facts of life to him about individual differences in human beings, psychology being a function of their individual differences in genetics, which is a concept he had never heard of and never considered in his life. And we were talking about it. Finally, at the end of this, after he realized after a while that I wasn't actually crazy, nor was I some Nazi nutcase. I mean, I actually had all the facts, and every single question I could explain the evidence. And he finally said, this is absolutely incredible. And I said, yes, it seems absolutely incredible, but you're an orthopedic surgeon. And if I had told you that people that were identical twins, separated at birth, had very similar knee structures, you wouldn't be surprised at all. And he goes, well, of course not. Mm-hmm. And there it is. We're just not used to thinking of the brain as an intricate device operating under genetic constraint. We simply don't think of it that way. We think of it like this developmental psychologist is thinking of it. He's thinking of it as a highly plastic, moldable machine that is highly being changed by environmental influence. There's many reasons why people think this, and for anyone who wants to do an exhaustive education in this, I highly recommend. If you haven't been to college in a long time and you want to take on a book that will really test your mental abilities, Steven Pinker's masterpiece called The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, is an exhaustive treatise about the problem that academic social science is having with grasping and choking down the truth about what we now know about human nature.
Yeah, I've always wondered when I've heard you say these things, why people just have such a hard time choking it down. And I've thought, maybe is it just people's disappointment that they can't get what they want? They can't change people into who they want. For instance, if someone's really, go ahead.
Yeah, the truth is, Nate, it's multifaceted. There's many reasons why. So, for example, it is true that human beings learn a tremendous amount by imitation. But the individual differences aren't coming about by imitation. But you might say, well, now, wait a minute. Some of them do. So if I grow up in my dad's car wash, I became a car wash king in the Central Valley. Didn't my environment have a lot to do with that? And the answer would be yes. But the reason why you became a car wash king in the Central Valley, the superficial levels of the situation are that you're an American operating under free enterprise, and your dad was highly conscientious and bright enough and emotionally stable enough to own a car wash place, and then you took it over and then you expanded it. Now you have 6 car washes and you're rich. Now you might say, well, my environment had everything to do with it, and I would say, well, no, it didn't. had you grown up in some other place in Kansas and your dad was a CPA, you might have become a CPA, or you would have gone to college and then you would have done this or that, and you would have been successful doing that too. In other words, the superficial issue is that it's a car wash. The conscientiousness and financial success is not a coincidence. Okay, and that's what we're talking about. So, if you have a high verbal IQ and you are Chinese, it doesn't mean that you're ever going to learn how to speak English worth a damn. Okay, but your high verbal IQ will be evident to anybody that speaks Chinese. And so, this Chinese is the superficial level of the information processing that's going on inside that brain. That I couldn't care less about that. That's just the little flavor on top. Okay, that plasticity is extraordinarily evident to people because we're very conscious of that plasticity, but we are not actually seeing that beneath that thin veneer of plasticity there is a genetic variation and constraint that is defining who that human being is. Okay, and so yes, of course, this gets to be disturbing for people when you start essentially saying people are very much constrained in who it is that they are and who they can become. So any developmental psychologist that thinks that they're going to come up with a program to increase the conscientiousness of humans is lost. They are absolutely, this is what I call being lost in non-Darwinian space. This is someone who's so out of touch with Darwin, they're just totally wandering out in the weeds and they have no idea what's going on. No, this is not
Those
how it is.
Those might be the real Darwin Awards.
Yeah, well, you know what? I have to say that unbeknownst possibly to many of these people, underneath the veneer of all this fight, there's many reasons that look noble or just ignorant and honest ignorance. But beneath it, a lot of it is sheer sexual and professional self-interest. That it is sexier to be someone who believes in the flexibility that you can turn any kid into anything. And it is also financially overwhelmingly in your best interest because that's how you survive in academia. If you come at academia honestly, and you come with an open mind and follow the data where the data goes, you're going to be in a pot of hot water in this area. And so that's the truth of it. So any good, solid, self-serving human being with a brain makes sure that they have just the right theory in academia in order to survive. And that, my friends, is where this article came from. All right.
Fantastic.
What else
do we have?
have?
Let's get to some listener emails.
Sure. Let's do it.
All right. So our first email has to do with how to make it past the first date. I couldn't comment on this, but Dr. Lisle, hopefully you can. So here's the question.
Okay.
Dear Dr. Lisle, I listened to the episode of Dr. Lisle saying that what men should do to have a successful first date is the goal is to not get ruled out. Right. I'm using online dating pretty much exclusively to go on dates with girls, and it seems like every time that I've met a girl that meets my standards physically, we'll have a pretty good first date. But then when I try to set up another date, I usually hear from her that she didn't really feel a connection. And based on what you guys talk about, it leads me to believe that they're essentially saying in an inoffensive way, I'm not physically attractive myself. But I remember you, Dr. Lisle, mentioning that for guys, that we want to take advantage of the repeat exposure effect since people like others who they become familiar with. So my question is, how do I take advantage of this effect when I'm consistently told there's no connection from the woman after we've only gone out on one date? And as a side thing, has online dating ruined this repeat exposure effect since people have to judge each other for romantic potential extremely quickly?
Really good, excellent question, good thinking, and a real live drama here from a listener that is struggling. So first of all, let's walk through this. The first thing that we are going to understand is that essentially human beings are trying to get the very best deal they can. And so typically the most important part of the deal that defines someone's mate value is their physical attractiveness. Yet another thing that my friends in academia don't want to face, okay? So this this overwhelmingly defines human mate value. Now, it's going to turn out that for both males and females, other features of personality are additive, or they're important, adding and subtracting mate value in the process. And it's going to turn out that the female of our species is going to be much fussier when it comes to activating her sexuality at first blush with males, because she's going to be defending her eggs, and so et cetera. So it's not, you're going to have to hit her circuits pretty darn well to have her interested in date 2, typically. Whereas a male, the same thing is going on, but it's slightly different. In other words, a female you might qualify, but you might not qualify at first blush, but under repeat exposure you could. Whereas males rarely find females more attractive over time because they're not having to guard the eggs, so their interest in a female is immediately evident to them. Now, one thing that we see about our caller here, or our listener, is that he is frustrated with the situation where when he meets someone that meets his standards physically, quote, they have a good date. Well, of course they do. He's enjoying himself because he's met someone that qualified. And then it turns out when he goes to set up another date, usually they're not so interested, which is exactly how I would expect it to be. The nature of the mathematics here is that anybody that you're interested in is rarely going to be interested in you. And anybody that's interested in you, you're rarely going to be interested in. So that's just straight math based on the fact that two people looking at each other can analyze how good looking everybody is and determine whether or not they think they're above them or below them. And if they think that if you think you're fancier than they are, then you're not interested. So what we didn't hear from our listener here was all the times when he wasn't interested in the female. He's like sort of ignoring that and brushing that aside, and he's lamenting what is happening at the moments when the female qualifies and he's interested, but suddenly now rarely she's interested. Well, that's exactly what's happening on the other side, but he's sort of dismissing that as if that's an unimportant part of the math problem that we're facing. Now, I'm not saying that that's what he's doing, but I'm saying we have to keep track of the fact that he's qualifying for a bunch of people that don't qualify for him, and then the same thing's happening on the other end. Now, he's absolutely right that we've got a problem in the modern environment about one-shot meetings. This is going to be much more difficult for the male than it is for the female. And the female, unfortunately, doesn't even know her own psychology, since she is unaware of the repeat exposure effect. She might even be conceptually aware of it, but unlikely that she is conceptually aware of it. But she doesn't have any intuition about it. And so as a result, she doesn't know that she was designed in the Stone Age with sexual excitation mechanisms that were designed to be inhibited on meeting novel males, particularly if they were in this zone of maybe sort of interesting but not that interesting, and it's not knocking my socks off. And so therefore I'm sort of feel so-so, like I don't feel any, quote, connection. It turns out that if you meet that guy half a dozen times, there's a chance that you would feel that connection. You're designed to meet him half a dozen times. My God, there's only 2,000 people on Earth in sub-Saharan Africa 83,000 years ago. So that's less people than there are in an American high school. So that shows you how few mate choices we had and how much connection that you had with these individuals, and therefore the repeat exposure effect was probably very often in effect in these situations. Now, so the modern female doesn't know that that's what's going on with her own psychology. And so as a result of that, you're under a lot of pressure, friend. When you ever show up to a date and that woman qualifies, you have to understand from the jump you're probably not going to qualify. So your job is to just try to get a first down. We're just trying to advance the ball down the field and not turn the ball over. So we're not going to take any chances. We're not going to take unusual political positions. We're not going to do anything. I could tell you a few things that we are going to want to do. You're going to want to dress well. You're going to want to absolutely make it very clear that you are paying. You are going to make sure that your hair, your clothes, your car, everything that you can control in terms of your appearance. You want to make sure that you are in good shape. In other words, if you're serious about this arena that we need to take seriously, making sure that we are in good physical condition, as good as we can get there. And then what we're going to want to do is you're going to want to, during that date, we're going to want to have very good social skill. So that means you're going to be asking them questions, and you're going to ask them intelligent, reasonable questions, and you're going to not stare in their eyes, but you're going to be making nice eye contact when they're speaking to us. And then you're also going to have, when there's going to be normal questions that are going to be coming from her, she's going to be asking you some things about you. This is a very good time for you to have scripted stories. So it would be very nice to actually realize that you're going to get asked, there's going to be 20 questions or 15 questions that some woman is going to ask you on a date. Because if nothing else, you ask her the question, and then she gives her answer, and then she asks you the same question, and right about then is when you have a scripted answer that's got some very clever self-effacing humor in this somewhere. Something funny, something interesting, etc. So this may sound like an extraordinary amount of effort to go to actually script yourself through a date, but the truth of the matter is this is serious business, and you've got problems. You don't have the repeat exposure effect helping you, and these two little people out on this date are trying to find what I call the magic 10%. And the 10% is where both of them feel like, hey, this is a heck of a good deal. I don't want to walk away from this. Well, obviously you are going to assess that it's a good deal by looking at her appearance, and then if it turns out that she doesn't have any wacky circuits in there that you can't stand, the truth is you're going to be interested if you find her sufficiently physically attractive. Your problem is she is likely not to find you the same. If she's fancier than you, she probably will not be finding you fancy. In fact, she's right on the line for ruling you out, and et cetera, which is exactly what's been happening. So what I'm saying here is that you got to bring your A game, and you're going to have to essentially make it such an interesting hour or 90 minutes that at the end of it she feels like, boy, I can't quite rule this guy out. I just can't quite rule him out. And then when you ask someone out the second time, you don't ask them like, hey, would you like to go out again? No. You have something interesting for them to do. And you need to be paying attention to what it is that their preferences and their likes are and what they like to do. So then you think about what would they find interesting and fun to do. And you may want to take this out of a romantic context for date 2 and make it to, concert in the park or something, or Shakespeare in the park. Who knows? The notion is here that we want to signal to her that we're not sitting there with bated breath hoping that she reciprocates our physical interest so that we can get into her sexuality. We want to signal to her that we are very patient and relaxed and we find her interesting as a person and would she maybe want to do this fun thing. That is a value proposition that is going to be more saleable. So these are some of the details these are things that we can control. And if it sounds like a lot of work, well, it is. And it takes a great deal of luck. Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. And someday, if you keep at it, you will eventually bump into a situation where the woman qualifies and you are maybe close to qualifying, but it's on the line and it's iffy. And if you're ready and you don't fumble the ball, you get a first down, and then from the first down, when she meets you the second time, it turns out that you're surprisingly a little bit handsomer than she remembered. And suddenly it starts to warm up. So that's the plan.
Dr. Lisle, you're making me all teary-eyed over here.
Okay.
I love it.
All right.
All right, so
What
we're going
else
to
do
turn
we
the ship
have?
around a little bit because our next
Yeah.
email from our listeners is a completely different topic.
Okay.
It has to do with politics. And
Okay.
the question is, Dear Dr. Lisle, why does so much anger exist from groups like Black Lives Matter and things like that? How will this anger ever be satisfied? What is the evolutionary psychology foundation for political correctness, and why is it so pervasive? Why is it so difficult for people to accept political incorrectness without feeling angry or insulted? And is there a way to make someone less sensitive to political incorrectness?
Interesting. Complicated question. The person's asking a lot of different things. So let me just take a pass at I think some sweeping issues. Whether it's Black Lives Matter or it's protesters anywhere in the U.S. complaining about anything, or Western Europe, this is nothing other than people feeling that things are unfair for their group, and it's going to be the case. All you have to do to actually get a feel for how biased people are at analyzing whether things are fair is just for your own entertainment. Turn on an NBA playoffs game this week and just watch it for 10 minutes. And you will see in that 10 minutes, the camera will be panning to the coaches of either team and the players as after call after call after call, they look like completely outraged and utterly disgusted and mystified by the refereeing. And this goes on all game long. Okay, so this is they're just besides themselves. They just can't believe how utterly unfairly they are being treated. Okay, now it's actually amazing that they can even agree to play, given how upset everybody is about the officiating. This tells you that the human being actually is not born with an objective mechanism for analyzing fairness. That they are, I don't know that anybody's ever put a parameter on it, but I personally have put the parameter at what I call 55-45. In other words, the average person is about 10% biased their own direction. So the average person, if it's 55-45 their way, in other words, they're getting 55% where 50% would have been fair, that feels about right, okay? As a sports fan myself, I've watched things where my team got a couple of breaks and won a close game, and I'm feeling like, now that was like really reasonable. That just feels like that was about right, okay? And so this is why it's difficult to do mediations. It's if anybody wants to see just how outrageous this can get, you go into family court and watch some child custody battles. That gets very entertaining. So this is nothing other than a group of people, in this case the Black Lives Matter people, saying, oh my God, this is just so outrageous. The black people, are being treated like they don't even matter. They're being slaughtered by the police, and they're being shut out of jobs, or I don't even know what all their complaints are. Okay. Now, the truth of the matter is that the objective evidence will show that the criminal justice system is utterly unbiased, and it's just not biased. If anything, actually, the research evidence shows that the criminal justice system bends over fairly backwards in order to treat African Americans fairly. So and it's going to be true that there's plenty of evidence, and I'm sure somebody with a little bit of data could be screaming right now up and down if they listen to this. But this is fact, and it's going to turn out that this is also true with the glass ceiling for women, etc. It's going to turn out that women are treated very fairly in the workplace, and if you're a woman that hasn't been treated fairly in the workplace, I'm going to argue that it isn't because you're a woman. It's just that you have a competitor and a difficult conflict of interest with somebody. And of course it's possible and happens that some boss tries to push around some female because of her sexuality and wants to harvest it and cheat, and et cetera. Of course that's going to happen. But en masse, that's not what's happening. And so it's going to turn out that women are treated very fairly, just as you would expect, and as all races are, with respect to their education, the amount of minutes that they work per day, and their amount of expertise, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, but this is not what people feel, okay? People have a strong tendency to say, I'm the member of a group that's being cheated. And so then what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to influence the political decision-making process in order to get concessions. And they feel very angry. So if we think back about how anger works, what anger is it's a threatening communication instinct that is designed to activate guilt mechanisms in an opposing party in order to gain concessions. That's what it is. And so all that Black Lives Matter is doing is that they're just another group of people, as has been true across history. This particular group doesn't have a single leg to stand on in terms of the evidence. Other groups have had. So if there's a Black Lives Matter group that was forming in 1965, believe me, they had every Martin Luther King was not an empty windbag. What they were talking about then was totally legitimate. And what they're talking about today is not, and we have the scientific evidence to prove it, but it's probably also sexy to be a member of that group, and therefore it adds to the people's sexual attractiveness. Now, so that's one. People are going to complain. The evolutionary psychology is that we're designed by nature to be biased in our analysis of what's fair, and the reason that is true is that it actually has paid to be biased. In other words, the genes that carry biased chips in their head and activate anger mechanisms have actually been able to acquire more resources than those that are more fair. And so you can imagine two little children, slightly genetically different, out of the same mother. And one of them is angry and bitching more about how it is that they've been shorted of food or attention. And it turns out that they get a little bit more food and attention, and they might wind up being a little bit more physically robust and wind up having a survival advantage over their more pleasant brother or sister. So these are human beings have evolved to have this sort of thing, and that's what you're seeing. Now, political correctness is a little bit different thing. This is sort of this actually has a sociological history in the United States. And once again, we're talking about in-group, out-group fairness issues, and so it's turned out in a little people that are paying attention. And I believe this was cooked up in academia. I think somewhere in the Ivy League, somewhere in the 1980s, about that this was a way for liberal agendas to essentially get some leverage, get to the moral high ground in order to activate guilt mechanisms. And so that's sort of what this is. This is a derivative of the very same general process of how to activate guilt mechanisms. And it can do so. In other words, you can feel like, well, wait, I didn't mean to be unfair, okay? And then they start pointing out that the way you use the language is actually in and by itself it has implications of unfairness in it. And sometimes that can get you back on your heels because you're thinking, well, now, wait a second. I do want to be fair, and if you are pointing out something that actually makes some sense, then it looks like I was a little guilty. And so you can certainly see how that would be possible and why it is that the world had to open its mind a little bit for some of the things that this movement was pointing out, and then it can get, of course, totally out of control and co-opted by the notion that we're going to use this to leverage wider agendas, et cetera, that are trying to get bigger and bigger concessions.
Fantastic.
All right.
Yeah, I remember reading the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley, and Malcolm X was, when he grew up, he remembered the phrase from from an adult figure that he looked up to, and the phrase was, "The squeaky wheel gets the grease." Yes.
When it comes to the fairness, unfairness, there was a fabulous motivational speaker in California in the 1980s and 90s by the name of Jim Rohn. And Jim Rohn, would tell a story about how, he was speaking in front of a group of business executives, and they were all speculating about, I think, the new president. It might have been Reagan or somebody else, I can't remember. And they said, and they're all speculating about what the new year was going to be like. And Rohn says, well, I know what the new year is going to be like. And they all crowded around. They said, well, Mr. Rohn, what's going to happen? What's it going to be like? And he said, it's going to be about like it's always been. There's going to be opportunity mixed with adversity, which is how it's always been. And that is how it is. In other words, there's some unfairness. There's some issues to squawk about. There's going to be people that are going to be more genetically disagreeable. They're going to band together and they're going to squawk a lot louder, trying to essentially utilize that technique. They don't know that they're trying to utilize that technique consciously. They feel morally righteous, just the way the NBA coach does, that he's being treated unfairly, and they're going to squawk and yell and threaten violence, and behind their righteous rage in order to try to get concessions. And that's what's happening. That's about how it's always been, as Jim Rohn would say.
Fantastic. All right, our next email.
Yeah.
Next email. What are men and women trying to signal with tattoos? And the follow-up question is, what are women trying to signal by getting tattoos in non-conspicuous locations, like behind the ear or on the ankle?
Well, I'm not sure anybody really knows, but let's take a broad pass at this. Certainly, getting a tattoo is going to be, to a certain extent, a signal of openness to experience, obviously. So that's one thing they're signaling. They are also potentially signaling for reasons that are possibly a bit opaque. They're probably signaling a bit of lowering conscientiousness and also some degree of disagreeability. So these are little elements in here that I believe are part of these signals. And so if you're putting them in inconspicuous locations, then this means that you are possibly a little bit more conscientious and you're a little bit worried about sending those signals to the broad public because they could be more costly than you want. But you want to be able to show under certain conditions, you want to be able to show these essentially these characteristics when they might be useful for you to show them. So, for example, you might want to show your tattoo to a handsome guy if you're a pretty good-looking girl, but not as good-looking as the handsome guy, and you actually are a little bit low in conscientiousness and open to experience, and you are therefore susceptible to the causal mating strategy. And so, therefore, rather than maybe make those obvious to everyone, you might make those more obvious to him under, there might be a way for you to signal that to him more specifically. So I could see that. Now here's a wacky idea that came from the book Spent by Jeffrey Miller, who is a brilliant evolutionary psychologist with a lot of really creative ideas. Miller says that tattoos potentially have been a method for human beings to actually open up their immune system to bacteria and then to demonstrate that they have a good immune system that could handle that challenge. So it's possible that this is essentially self-injurious behavior that is an advertisement for a higher level immune function. And that may be a potential evolutionary reason for tattoos in general. So I don't know how one would prove that, and I don't know if that's true, and or if it's partly true. Certainly, tattoos are more than just that. There's all kinds of these other signaling processes that are going on, but that is a possibility why human beings even came up with this. as a potential, essentially, a signaling tactic. It's clearly a signaling tactic. I mean, why else would you do it? The reason you write a newspaper article is for somebody to read it. And the reason why you put a tattoo on your body is for other people to observe it and to make inferences about you. So it is clearly a signal, and the things we're trying to signal tend to be Big Five related, and Big Five and intelligence related. So we would want to be signaling things that would have an influence on other people's behavior and influence things like mate choices, friend choices, and the challenges. For example, you can imagine that if you lived in a rough neighborhood with a bunch of rivaling gangs, you might want to have tattoos that would signal that you are an extremely dangerous person that had better not be messed with. So this is all kinds of little elements that might go into this. Did I lose you? I cannot hear Nate. All right. Well, I think that if I'm talking and Nate can't hear me and I can't hear him and people can hear me or they can't hear me, whatever's going to happen, I think what we're going to do at this point is we're going to wrap it up for this evening. And I think we've covered enough for one night, and we will be back next week with more listener questions. Keep those questions coming. These are very interesting. We have some more that we intended to get to tonight and didn't, and we'll work right down through those next Wednesday evening, and we look forward to having you back next week. Thank you.
Fantastic. Dr. Lisle, thank you very much.